Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to welcoming you to this second episode of our webinar series, The Taste Of, Shining a Light on our Executive MBA. So the theme today will be, thank you, preventing corporate scandal or creating sustainable value, the role of corporate governance. So I'm here today with Peter Wirtz to discuss this interesting theme. So I'll let you maybe briefly introduce yourself and then start talking about this interesting subject.
Yes. Thank you, Marie. Yes, welcome everyone to this masterclass. So let me just present myself quickly. I have a PhD in management science, and I'm a professor of corporate governance and finance. I'm also a senior member of the IFGE, that's the French Institute of Corporate Governance, which is a research center and think tank, which is actually here at EMLYON Business School. And I'm also responsible for research valorization and research funding at EMLYON Business School. I have been the former vice president of research at University Lyon 3 in France, and as such, I'm also a practitioner actually of governance, of corporate governance, because I was attending regularly the board of directors of the university, and I was part of the executive team trying to move forward with major strategic issues. But I also have a long-standing research expertise actually on corporate governance, and my main fields actually of research are on the link between governance and value creation. More recently, I've invested a lot in research and getting to better know entrepreneurial finance and entrepreneurial governance. So of younger ventures and startups actually working on the corporate governance life cycle. So what goes on when corporate governance is created for the very first time at the birth state actually of corporate governance. And I've also done some research on specific institutions of organizational governance, which is more comprehensive than only corporate governance, because every organization has its governance system and its governance structures. Here's just a little sample of my publications, if you wish. There's a couple of books here. I've worked on corporate governance best practice, actually, 2 books on this subject. The book on the new perspectives is pretty much on the link between actually governance and value creation. That will be the theme of today's masterclass. And the green book there is on issues of entrepreneurial finance and entrepreneurial governance. And here's a sample of my more recent scientific publications in academic journals, in the British Management Journal, for example, and in the European Management Journal. So two research papers on entrepreneurial governance and on kicking off the corporate governance life cycle. As I said, what goes on when corporate governance is created at the very beginning of at the startup stage actually of a company. And then I've done also some work on changing governance institutions in a country such as France, which is the third paper you'll see here. So let's get started actually with this masterclass. So just to set the stage, right? I mean, the issue will be to work on how corporate governance can possibly play a role in the creation of sustainable value. And to set the stage, we of course will have to speak with a common vocabulary. We can communicate, so we'll have to define corporate governance. What is corporate governance? And then once we understood what corporate governance is, how does it actually work? Because it's a living, it's an organization. Reality is not just about static mechanisms, right? And then once we've defined the issues and the workings of corporate governance, and we'll be interested in what type of value creation we're speaking about, and then we'll ask how those two issues are actually related, corporate governance and sustainable value creation here. Okay, just to start, That is taken from the picture you see is taken from The Economist in 2013, and that's pretty much a representation of how corporate governance is seen through the lens of the Anglo-American mainstream approach to corporate governance, right? What this picture shows is actually three types of actors, right? You have the top management team, which is sort of hiding behind the table, right? The people in dark gray, the CEO, the chief executive officer, and one member of his top executive team. You have the board member, which are sort of squeezed under the table here, and then you have this giant who's representing all the shareholders actually of the corporation. And so the shareholders are pretty much trying to sort of, control, constrain the other actors through a mechanism which is the general meeting, actually the general shareholder meeting here. So that's pretty much the mainstream representation, and it is. And it is very much related, actually, to the to one of the two dimensions of this masterclass, which is a question about scandal and about possibly conflicting interests between different types of actors. So, as we've seen when we speak about corporate governance is actually about actors and about mechanisms. So let's speak a little bit about the actors that are at stake here when we talk about corporate governance. The key actors that are usually focused on when we speak about corporate governance, and not the governance of any organization, but specifically about for-profit organizations and more specifically corporations. The key actors, there's three of them actually, at least when we take it from the Anglo-American mainstream. The shareholders, who sort of represent the sovereign power of the organization, right? The executives, and the foremost executive is the chief executive officer of the corporation, who represents the executive power, and then the directors, who are the board members, who represent a control power. Pretty much like in a state, right, where you have three different types of power that are more or less in balance: a sovereign power and an executive power and a control power. So represented by the shareholders for a corporation, for a listed stock corporation, for example, the CEO as the chief executive, and then the directors who represent a control power, right? But then I put on the slide other actors. And actually, the mainstream really doesn't focus a lot on other stakeholders. So why? And that's one topic we will get into during this masterclass. So why is it that we only focus so much on shareholders and not on other stakeholders? And we'll see that actually in terms of trying to create and to sustain long-term value creation, other stakeholders may be very important. That's why I put them on green on this slide. So we'll speak about this in terms of different approaches to value creation and the actors that are at stake here. And then in terms of control power, right, I also put some examples in black here on this slide. Judges who might also, at some point of time play a role in sort of controlling what is going on with the executive power. Members of the press and others, such as whistleblowers, maybe in the organization, which also sort of represent one type of control power. So it's not only the board, right? The question then is, well, we've spoken about the actors that may play a role to a certain extent in corporate governance, but those actors, for them to be able to interact with the executive power and with each other, they go through a certain organizational institutional mechanisms, actually, right? The actors, they need leverage to be able to act with each other. And here's a sample of what corporate governance mechanisms are typically at stake mistake when people talk about corporate governance. The shareholders, for example, act with the general meeting. So the general meeting, the general assembly of shareholders, is a corporate governance mechanism. The board of directors is an organizational mechanism, of course, where board members interact with the CEO, and also sometimes with the shareholders or some shareholders, or in some corporate governance systems, also other stakeholders, right? In Germany, for example, you should know that on the supervisory boards of the largest, quote, stock corporations, of the corporations of more than 2,000 employees, actually, half of the directors are actually employee representatives. So the board of directors is one of those governance mechanisms where some of the stakeholders may interact with the executive power. Corporate law is a corporate governance mechanism, right? Corporate law exerts some control to a certain extent. The courts are a corporate governance mechanism, right? Because they will be there to see to it that actually the corporate law is respected. So courts are commercial courts, for example, are corporate governance mechanisms. Contracts are corporate governance mechanism, because in contracts shareholders may put in place, for example, incentive and control mechanisms to control the chief executive, right? The bylaws of a corporation are typically a contract, and the bylaws provide for, well, the organization of the board, right? How many board members there will be, because the law doesn't set a precise number, right, of the number of directors that should sit on a board. So all of this will be put down in the bylaws, and that's just a sample of different corporate governance mechanisms. It wouldn't probably be possible to have an exhaustive list of all existing corporate governance mechanisms, and actually, when you look at specific corporations, at specific companies, not all mechanisms are always present, all possible mechanisms, and so there's the corporate governance mechanism of a specific organization actually will take some of those bricks, some of those building stones, but each corporate governance system may be configured in a very specific way. What we can do, though, is to try to organize, to characterize corporate governance mechanisms and to classify them. And at least we cannot have an exhaustive list, but here you have a classification which we owe to actually one of the very first French researchers, colleagues who worked on corporate governance, Charot, who about 25 years ago set down this classification, where we distinguish between specific governance mechanisms and non-specific governance mechanisms. What do we mean by specific mechanisms? Those are mechanisms that are applicable to one specific organization, say to, I don't know, Renault, for example, right? With its very specific board of directors, its very specific executive remuneration system, its internal audit, and so forth. So that are very specific governance mechanisms. Then, on the other side, we have non-specific mechanisms. Those are mechanisms which are more at an institutional level, that is to say, which are applicable to all organizations, all firms in a specific country, for example, right? The French corporate governance system is different from the German or the American one, or even the English corporate governance system. So the legal environment, the corporate law, right, which sets down a certain number of conditions to organize a corporate board, is of course very specific to each country, but it's not specific to any specific corporation organization in that country. So the corporate law, corporate governance codes are all non-specific corporate governance mechanisms. Legal audit There's also a corporate governance mechanism which is not specific to one. So the fact that the financial statements of a corporation have to be controlled every year and have to be stamped with a seal actually of the legal auditors is of course a control mechanism to reduce information asymmetry, and that the way legal audit is organized is of course not specific to a corporation either. And then we can distinguish corporate governance mechanisms on a second dimension in terms of their intentionality, right? What do we mean by this? Intentional governance mechanisms are mechanisms that are created by the intentions of specific actors who want to achieve certain results, right? The board of directors is organized. Well, people are recruited on the board of directors according to the criteria that the shareholders want them to have specific qualities, competencies, independence, so this kind of thing, and of course, I mean it's not a hazard. It's that the board looks the way it looks. So that would be an intentional corporate governance mechanism, as is corporate law, right? Because it's the result of a legislative process. But then there are also spontaneous corporate governance mechanisms. What do I mean by this? Spontaneous governance mechanisms are mechanisms that are not the result of fiat, of the explicit wish of certain people. They are the result actually of the decentralized and spontaneous interaction between people in the social world. Corporate culture, for example, is typically a spontaneous mechanism. So it's not dictated. You don't dictate. You don't create a corporate culture because you want to. It's the result, of the interactions between people in a society, basically, right? So that would be a spontaneous market mechanism. All market mechanisms are actually spontaneous market mechanisms, right? The market for corporate control for stock listed corporations is actually spontaneous mechanisms because you cannot dictate the market outcome, right? When there's a control challenge for a corporation, right? When there's a hostile takeover attempt where one corporation wants to take over another one, and the incumbent management tries to defend itself, not to get kicked out. Well, you see that this is a corporate governance mechanism in the sense that it's a control mechanism somehow, and if a hostile takeover succeeds, so the incumbent management top CEO is kicked out, the result of a hostile takeover battle is not dictated by one person or even a group of persons. It will be the result of the decentralized interplay between offer and demand, right? So market mechanisms are typically spontaneous corporate governance mechanisms. And of course, there may be specific spontaneous mechanisms such as firm culture, a specific firm culture, or informal networks of trust, which concern one specific corporation. And then there may be non-specific spontaneous mechanisms, right? Like the financial market, as I already said. But also, for example, the labor market for top management, for top managers, right? The labor market for CEOs is also sort of a corporate governance mechanism. So now I hope we're set about what we're speaking about when we speak about corporate governance. The actors and the corporate mechanisms they use to interact with one another, and once we've defined actually, or we've seen the different mechanisms and the actors, what would be a good definition to sum it all up, to say what really, if we have to put it in a nutshell, how could we define really corporate governance? Well, here you have a couple of definitions. I only give 3 of those. Of course, there's many more out there, and depending on what you try to look at in corporate governance, right? I mean, corporate governance is a complex organizational reality, and the way you want to define, it depends also what aspect of corporate governance you want to look at. And of course, law scholars are interested in corporate governance, but they will have their own definitions. Economists, sociologists would have different definitions still of corporate governance. Well, here we're in management, right? I mean, it's a management school, and as management scholars, we are typically interested in how we can act on collective organizational behavior, and so we will have definitions which are compatible with the concerns of what we try to do in a management school. So the work definition I would prefer and that I would like to stick with is the very first one. It's a very large definition, as you will see, proposed by Charot. Actually, corporate governance being defined as the mechanisms which frame managerial decision-making, that is to say, which govern the CEO's conduct. Okay, so corporate governance is really an organizational mechanism, but which does not concern the whole organization, but only the top level of the organization. So it's about, organizing the equilibrium of power really at the helm, at the very top of the corporation. All mechanisms that govern a CEO's conduct. See, that's a very wide definition. It's a different definition from the one the mainstream academia, which is pretty much Anglo-American, will propose for corporate governance. I just presented on this slide, so you will have it, and it helps you understand why actually I prefer the first one once we're through with this masterclass, and actually the opposition between the two definitions, the large one and the mainstream definition, which is due to Schleifer and Vishny, actually published the same year as a large definition, as you'll see. Actually, it's the mainstream definition is very, very limited, very restrained, and actually Schleifer and Vishny will define corporate governance as the ways in which suppliers of finance to corporations will assure themselves of getting a return on their investments. So, see, it's very narrowly focused on only financial stakeholders, and especially actually shareholders, and it's only focused on getting a financial return, right? On managing the interest actually of the financial stakeholders of the corporation, right? Then I also give you a third definition, which is sort of a halfway definition between the two we've seen, which would define corporate governance as all control and incentive mechanisms which align managerial conduct with shareholder interests. So that's a halfway definition. Why? Because it's largely in focus in terms of what are the stakeholders we're concerned with, right? We look in this midway definition at all possible stakeholders and not only the financial stakeholders. So it's larger than the very focused mainstream definition, which is only on financial stakeholders and shareholders. But it's still more limited than the large definition because it doesn't control managerial conduct in a very wide fashion, but also only to sort of align interests, right? It's all about managing possibly divergent or conflicting interests. So what all of this boils down to is that at least this discussion about definitions helps us understand that one challenge, definitely, of corporate governance is the protection of interests. So that is undeniable, right? And actually what we call corporate governance codes, and there's many of them out there, which are sort of codes or documents that are codes of best practice, as they're also called in terms of corporate governance practice. Well, governance codes are typically, those that are around, are typically born as a reaction to scandal. That's actually where the title came from for this masterclass, right? Because scandal is about divergent interests and some stakeholders, especially the CEO, maybe sort of stealing from the shareholders to in his own very egoistic private interest, and many of the corporate scandals came from this, and many corporate governance codes or code of best practice were born actually as a reaction, as a direct reaction to those scandals. And so what is pretty much in the focus then is managing potentially conflicting interests. But the question then is, in terms of sustainability, if we really look at it in terms of sustainability and creating sustainable value, can it only be about avoiding stealing, scandal, and managing potentially conflicting interests? I think no. It's and that's what we try to work on now in this masterclass. But before we get to the sustainability issue, just sum up some of the challenges, right? First of all, we could ask, actually, because the corporate governance debate actually is very large, and we could ask, is corporate governance actually something that applies to corporations only? And then when you look at it, actually all organizations have governance, right? Be it universities, churches, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and even certain for-profit organizations, cooperatives, for example, right? There's many firms that are cooperatives. Cooperatives are not corporations in a strict sense, but of course they also have governance. They have boards of directors, and so forth, right? But whatever the organization, it often boils down to a couple of governance mechanisms, which are real key and central for this one organization. In the corporation, it will be the board of directors. In a monastery, for example, right, we were speaking about a religious organization, maybe the corporate chapter, and so there's often, one or a couple of key organization mechanisms which will characterize a specific type of organization and which will crystallize the attention of analysts. And this mechanism, of course, controls major decisions and the conformity of those decisions with the institutional norms, right? This organizational control mechanism will be actually accountable, right? The control mechanism will be accountable to what we may call the sovereign power of the organization, right? The control power will be accountable to the sovereign power, right? Here's just an example, of a very, very old organizational governance mechanism. Here you have a picture which is from the Middle Ages, right? Goes back more than 1,000 years, and just that everyone realizes that organizational governance is actually as old as structured organizations, right? It's not, although there's been a lot of discussion about corporate governance due to scandal of the last 30 years or so, actually corporate governance as an organizational reality is not new, right? And actually, Benedictine monasteries are the oldest still living organization in the contemporary world, and maybe they have sort of a specific governance that may be at least in part responsible for the sustainability over the long run, because sustainability is also related to long-term survival. So and I know there's colleagues that are working in management history actually, which try to work on this issue. Well, that's not the object today. Just was to have you realize, though, that there's been a recent focus on corporate governance on very, very specific issues. But sometimes, when things that are sort of proclaimed as being best practice, but that don't prevent scandal, recurrent scandal, well, maybe sometimes it can be interesting also to get inspiration from elsewhere, especially in terms of sustainability, right? But let's refocus on the corporate governance. So in corporate governance, the selected mechanisms would be, the three here: the General Assembly, which represents actually the shareholders, as being the sovereign power; the Board of Directors, representing the control power; and the Executive Committee, where you have the top executive, the TMT, the top management team members, and their leader, the CEO, right? And so those corporate governance mechanisms will be the levers through which those different actors can interact, right? And of course, we have a certain number of challenges when it comes to corporate governance. important basic challenges are then the organization of the interaction between the different powers, right? Which is sort of a dynamic reality. It's not static. And actually, what will be the ultimate challenge of the balance of power? I mean, it's not an objective as such, right? Why do the powers and the different powers in a for-profit organization such as a corporation interact with each other? Well, it's in a for-profit organization. It's to create value and possibly long-term value, right? So that then leads us to the question that leads us to double question, actually, to two questions: how to share the value created between different types of actors, and how to really create value. So those are two issues, two major challenges: the creation and the sharing of the created value, which are interrelated with interact. The focus of this masterclass will be, of course, more on the creation side of value, and we'll get to this in a couple of seconds. So that's here the main focus, right? How do governance mechanisms, and in the corporation, the board of directors is one of the foremost governance mechanisms. How does it, you've seen our definition, corporate governance, govern the behavior of the top executives? So how does governance possibly influence, govern CEO behavior, which then will lead to more or less sustainable value creation, right? Well, the question about value creation is not a simple one. Actually, organizational performance conceived as the creation of value is really very, very complex. And still today, there's often many more questions than there are final answers, right? Although, research has made some headway. But I mean, still the question remains, how can we define value creation? How can we measure it? There's actually different concepts of value creation out there. And so each different concept needs also an approach in terms of how can we observe, how can we measure possibly, different approaches to value creation. And then once we've defined and measured value, under what conditions is it sustainable over the long run, right? And of course, we have theory. The natural way to look at it would be to look at finance first. And as a matter of fact, actually, finance scholars were among the first ones to get interested in corporate governance, right? Why finance? Because finance is all about value creation, right? And of course, shareholders are part of the financial community. Okay, but when you look at finance theory and the way it conceives of value creation and its link with corporate governance, you will see that actually it has put exclusive focus on only shareholder value as the single most important metric of organizational performance. And as you've seen, that is sort of limited, right? I mean, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to you when I tell you that the very restrictive definition of corporate governance, due to Schleifer and Vishny, that we've seen a couple of minutes ago, is actually due to finance scholars, right? Actually, Schleifer and Vishny are finance scholars working at American universities. What one should know is that this approach has had a very, very important influence on how we approach and measure organizational performance and on the ends towards which corporate governance mechanisms are formatted, right? The public debate actually has very much been influenced by the financial mainstream, to the point that we often don't realize what the underlying assumptions are, those very restrictive assumptions, right? And when we try to really look at it, we will realize that actually this approach is not always very realistic, right? And it's not relevant to all types of organizations. And the question then is, if not, what are the alternatives, right? But before we work on the alternatives, we have to very well understand what the mainstream is actually about. Actually, to put it in a nutshell, there's two approaches, two visions of the role of governance in value creation and distribution. The first vision, the first approach is the nexus of contracts approach, and the interests that are attached, right? So this first approach is the one that finance theory promotes, which is focusing only on the interests of different stakeholder categories, especially the potentially conflicting interests of the top management and the shareholders. And actually it's an approach where we look only at the contracts, which implicit or explicit, which exist between different stakeholder categories. And contracts are, of course, a mechanism to regulate, to manage interests, right? That's what we look at when we look at contracts. Contracts cannot draw, contracts cannot define a strategy, a corporate strategy, right? Which is something more dynamic and so which depends on more than just the resources everyone brings and the contracts we attach to them. But that is the mainstream approach. The second approach is actually to look at the corporation as a pool of resources, and especially as a pool of cognitive resources. What do I mean by cognitive resources? Cognitive resources are actually the knowledge and the competencies of the management, but also potentially of the directors, or even certain shareholders. And that second approach, which is basically linked to research much more coming from the strategic management tradition and not the financial management tradition. So this cognitive approach to corporate governance will be much more important from my point of view than the nexus of contracts approach when we talk about sustainable long-term value creation, right? Because when the firm is seen as a nexus of contracts only, and for those who are interested in this, the reference would be agency theory, which is sort of the theoretical framework speaking about the nexus of contracts. Well, when the firm is only seen as a nexus of contracts, governance mechanisms' role is only to protect the legitimate interests of different stakeholders, especially shareholders, right? But that is more a question of value distribution, right, than of authentic creation of value. Of course, if you want to distribute a pie, we first have to bake it, right? We have to create it. But actually, when you look at it closely, finance theory does not say much about the creation of the pie, of the value to start with. That's sort of an exogenous matter for finance scholars, right? Quite surprisingly, actually, right? But that's the finance approach, right? It's about conflicting interests. And then the mainstream, even in the public, in the large public, the corporate governance debate is then generally triggered by major conflicts. So here you have two guys, right? Robert Maxwell, which actually, when he passed away in 1991, actually sort of triggered a whole scandal in the United Kingdom because people sort of realized that he had really stolen from his company and the other shareholders. There had been a massive transfer of money from the employee pension fund, for example, at the Maxwell Group, right, which is the major media and communications group in the United Kingdom. And that scandal actually had people realize that, of course, there may be conflicting interests and corporate governance mechanisms failed most likely, and the failure of corporate governance systems was responsible for part of what happened there. And that actually, the Maxwell case was actually the trigger for a large debate in the United Kingdom on corporate governance and for drawing up the first actually corporate governance code of best practice of corporate governance in the United Kingdom, which later became so under the Cadbury Committee. Actually, the Cadbury Corporate Governance Code was the very first one in Europe, and it was then regularly updated. It became then the combined code in the United Kingdom, which is still applied for it's actually a listing requirement for British corporations to make a declaration in conformity with this code today. And then the Cadbury Code has served at the template for many corporate governance codes worldwide, such as the French one. France actually followed in 1995 with its first corporate governance code, which was the Virno report, as it was called then, and now it's been regularly updated, and it's called the AFEP-MEDEF code. But when you compare the two codes, the British one and the AFEP-MEDEF code, they're very close in terms of what they're saying. And not surprisingly, most of the best practices that are promoted in those codes are on, avoiding conflicting interests. So they will stipulate that you have to have a majority of independent directors on the board, so not to have too many conflicting interests and this stuff. And of course, 10 years later, you may recall the Enron scandal, right, which was a major scandal and which one again re-triggered the debate on corporate governance worldwide, and which led actually to legislation also on conflicting interests through the SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, right, in the United States and so forth. And all of those scandals, of course, had a very, very important impact on shareholder value, right? The graph you see here is actually the sharp decline in just a couple of weeks, right, of the Enron stock price, which sort of dove down basically to zero, almost as a result of the scandal. So, most of the public debate is very much linked to this purely financial vision, but it's more about shareholder value, and it really doesn't answer the question of where do the sustainable long-term projects actually come from. So, yes. So it's all about distributing the pie. But the question really of value creation, of an authentic creation of value, goes beyond interest and distribution, right? And then if we look from it at a different perspective through strategic management theory, right? Then we can look at the firm as a pool of cognitive resources. And then we can reinterpret the role that a corporate board may play in governing managerial behavior. So governing managerial behavior, the behavior of the CEO can be, of course, in terms of controlling, keeping under control his personal interest, but governing the behavior may also be in terms of supporting his acquisition of specific strategic and managerial competencies and knowledge, right? So from the cognitive perspective of corporate governance mechanisms can be seen actually as a lever of cognitive value creation, and potentially sustainable cognitive value creation, right? And then the board is not only a monitoring mechanism, seeing of how the CEO potentially appropriates personal interest or not. It may be about serving as a sounding board for the proposition of a long-term strategy which would be sustainable and exploit new opportunities and so forth, right? So, but that of course then means that if you want to be the corporate board, to be a co-creator of the pie, right, of the value, and to do it in a sustainable long-term way, then it's not sufficient just to recruit on the board independent directors. You may want to target directors with very specific competencies, and those competencies are actually not generic. What I'm trying to say is that the competencies you want to recruit on a board depend really very much on the specific and individual corporation, right? On its industry, on its industrial sector, on possibly on where a company is in its life cycle, right? I mean, a strong growth necessitates different competencies from corporations at maturity or even at the startup level, and so the issue and the challenges of corporate governance in terms of the competencies of directors. If you want to use the corporate board as actually a lever to create sustainable value, may be very specific, and you have to look at it on a case by case basis, actually, right? So just one example. At the turn of the century, actually, there was a major conflict between minority shareholders and the incumbent management of a corporation which is well known by the French, which is a shoe retailer, actually, Groupe André at that time, and there was a big conflict between the incumbent management and a minority outside shareholder represented by Guy Weiser Pratt. And there was a conflict, but that was not a conflict of interests. No one said, even the contesting shareholder, Guy Weiser Pratt, didn't say, well, he's trying to pursue his own interests and so forth. Actually, it was a conflict about the strategic vision. What would be the best strategy in the years to come, to have the corporation create more and more sustainable value? And that was a conflict about where the shops should be localized, inside the towns or outside the cities, and this kind of question. And this conflict was actually resolved through a corporate governance mechanism, which was a proxy contest, which helped the minority shareholder gain control over the corporate board at that time. And when they gained control over the corporate board, actually they changed the strategic vision. And in the 3, 4, 5 years to come, that actually had a strong impact at that time on the value creation of that corporation. So, see, conflict is not necessarily a conflict about conflicting interests. It may be a strategic, a cognitive conflict, right? Where people, because strategy is not a science. It's not something you put in a machine and then you press on a button and you have the best value creating strategy. That's unfortunately sometimes that in finance people like approach this issue. It's the strategy is actually an art, right? You put a bet on what your vision of the future will be, future markets, of what the ideal value creation projects would be. So the cognitive approach really is something quite relevant. So really, to sum it up, if we look at how the corporate board can then have an influence on sustainable value creation. Really, we have those two dimensions, right? The corporate board can act as a lever of control to control possibly conflicting interests, but that's more about value distribution. But it can also play, if we let it do this part of the work, a very important role as a counselor, right? Give advice, help the management team to acquire more knowledge and competencies, be they managerial or strategic. So you can have the two levers. But this, of course, has an impact on how the board will work, right? And okay, and just to give you a very last slide here. So to really conclude on some of the very, very contemporary issues of corporate governance, what I'm showing you here, actually, I took this. I took the figure which is in the light gray, in the light gray rectangle from work which is done by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, right? Which is sort of a think tank which is trying to see how we can observe and measure actually sustainable long-term sustainable climate performance, right? Actually, this the task force on climate-related financial disclosure is actually chaired by Michael Bloomberg, whom you know as one of the main providers of financial information, to see how we could measure long-term sustainable environmental and climate performance, right? And so they will explain that climate risks and opportunities will have an impact, on the cash flow of an organization and on its cash flow statement. So ultimately on its value creation, actually through in two ways. There's climate-related risks, like risks related to the evolving legal environment, right? There's more and more regulation on climate risks, and so a corporation that doesn't conform to the climate regulation exposes itself to litigation and to risks, financial risks, which are linked to that. There are technology-related risks. There are risks related to reputation. So this is actually something which is very much linked to scandal and to different interests, right? So the board of directors can play a role through playing on its disciplinary level, right, on potentially conflicting interests. So that would be sort of the mainstream approach, which has something to say on regulating those risks, right? So sort of trying to manage climate-related conflicts of interest. But the board of directors can also play a cognitive role in really creating or contribute at least to create cognitive value and sustainable climate performance by helping the CEO to think about and to capture climate-related opportunities, right? Related to new climate markets, to climate-related green technology, and so forth. So that's basically what I was trying to expose. And then if you have any questions, then please go ahead, and I'll be happy to answer these.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for this interesting masterclass. Indeed, we still have a few minutes. If you have questions and want to take this opportunity to have Peter here with us in order to ask him your questions. I see we actually do have a few questions already online. Someone is asking, do corporate governance codes take into account the sustainable dimension?
Yes. As I've told you, the first corporate governance codes were born out of scandal, right? And not surprisingly, most of what is said in them are recommendations of best practice, which would be there to manage corporate scandal. Now, the sustainability issue has been progressively introduced, at least into the wording of the codes, right? When you look, for example, at the last update of the French corporate governance code drafted by the MEDEF, you will see in the general introduction that one ultimate goal of corporate governance should also be sustainable value creation. So there's at least some consciousness that is sort of entering the debate, and people are saying now, okay, the codes should integrate this. But then when you look into inside the codes and at the specific tools the codes propose, the intentions that are proclaimed right in the introduction of the codes well, I don't want to be mean. I mean, one could say they pay lip service, right, to what is now the larger debate in society about sustainability. So there is awareness, but when we look at the specific tools and practices that are proposed by the codes, then it's still, let's say, difficult to give a precise number. We would have to do the word count, but I mean, it's still 90% about managing conflicting interests, and then there's some some opening to the more sustainable issue. Just to give you a precise example, right? The boards will say, well, you would need a proportion of independent directors, so that's more about, conflicting interests. And then they will say you should organize the corporate board in committees which would focus on specific issues. Now, the committees that the governance codes are really focused on are the remuneration committee with CEOs, so that's about interests, right? It will be the audit committee, so that is about legal audit and information asymmetry and basically, financial information, right? And it will be the nomination committee. So whom will we nominate as a CEO? So among the three committees, the only one which has sort of a cognitive impact would be the nomination committee. Then the code provides for the possibility to have a strategic committee also. So that could be in sort of, the cognitive approach. But when you look at the number of pages in the code, which talk about, the remuneration committee, and you compare it to the strategic committee, you have a couple of lines for the strategic committee, and then, many, many pages on the other committees. And when you look at the practice of many of the stock listed corporations from this regard, not many really have a very active strategic committee. So to answer it short, to give a short answer, yes, the cognitive issue has been introduced, and the long-term strategic sustainable value creation issue has been introduced into codes. In its intention, a couple of mechanisms are there, but it's still quite marginal.
Thank you. Another question for you. So we're talking about the sustainable issue in corporate governance. Does it mean that the conflict of interest are not an issue anymore in corporate governance?
Well, no. I'm not saying, even though, I may have been a bit critical during my presentation with respect to the mainstream approach about conflicting interests and stuff. But that was to make a point. The mainstream is there, it's very important. So it was to sort of, introduce then the alternative approach. But I'm not saying that this should replace, the reflex that we have acquired over 30 years of corporate governance debate on the scandal issues and on potentially conflicting interests, right? No, one shouldn't be naive, right? There will always be conflicting interests, as the founders of positive agency theory, Jensen and Meckling, would say, we don't live in a nirvana economy, right? So you have to be realistic. Whenever there is organized collective action where you have more than one person, you cannot expect that two persons have exactly the same agenda and exactly the same interests. So it's normal for there to be conflicting interests. You have to get them in balance somehow, right? So no, one has to be realistic. My plea would be for an integrative approach to corporate governance where you take into account the two, right? Of course, then you would have to assure that you limit the potential conflicts of interest and whatever. The question, the real question then is, however, how do you balance the two, right? How much energy you should devote to and put into trying for the board to be sort of a strategic support for long-term value creation for the management team, and how much effort you and money also you should put into controlling, right? Because of course corporate governance comes as a cost. And there's no one unique answer, actually. It depends very much on the specific situation of the organization, partly due to the organizational life cycle, right? Take a young entrepreneurial venture. When you have an entrepreneur who is the founder of his company, at the very beginning, when he's the only shareholder, when he holds 100% of his own stock, there's not much of a conflict of interest with himself, right? Everything he takes from the company well, he will lose the value of the company that he's 100% the owner of, which does not mean that he doesn't have an interest in creating a corporate board, because sometimes he's lonely, right? I mean, I have colleagues who work on the loneliness of the entrepreneur and of the hardship that may create for some entrepreneurs. So he may need some input, you know, and also some strategic input. So at that point of time, you know, at the very early life cycle stage, maybe the cognitive role in this specific hypothetical example I gave you, the cognitive role of the board would be much more important than the disciplinary role. But then you would have to anticipate possible future conflicts of interest if you try to then fund growth and open the capital. So at other life cycle stages, and the balance between, you know, the cognitive lever that you would like to act on or the more disciplinary lever will change also in terms of, you know, the growing pool of stakeholders that will interact with the corporation.
Thank you. And to end up this masterclass, we actually have someone sharing their own experience. So thank you very much for this great presentation. Few words for the problematics I encounter with corporate governance: long-term strategy, a good authority distribution, communication, and transparency must be maintained.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this comment. I mean, this is really, I mean, I agree 100%, right? And it's not only about codes and defining mechanisms in a code, right? It's, you know, I mean, what really shows up in your comment is it's also about everyday process and work and how we engage the actual practice of corporate governance, right? Because I mean, one of the dangers actually that we sometimes have with corporate governance is an approach where you just do box ticking, right? And so you have a corporate governance code where, you know, sort of recommendations are codified, and then the corporation will say, okay, I have an independent board and so forth. But practice, actual practice about, you know, maintaining long-term transparency, interacting on a long-term strategy and so forth, is also about the actors and not only about the mechanisms, you know, and that really needs the lifeblood, you know, of the people that interact. That also needs their ethics, right? And because if you are just in the box ticking approach, then you may end up like Enron, because actually Enron did all this box ticking, right? And what is quite sort of edifying is that like the year before the scandal broke, actually Enron was awarded in the press a prize of a very sound corporate governance according, you know, to the box ticking criteria. So I agree, yeah. So just let me say a last word maybe on, actually here at EMLYON, we have the most important actually research center specifically devoted to corporate governance, which is the IFGE, the French Corporate Governance Institute, Institut Français de Gouvernance des Entreprises, which was created by Pierre-Yves Gomez here at EMLYON, and which is actually not only an academic research center where we produce knowledge about corporate governance, but also a think tank, and which is actually one of the main contributors to the second official corporate governance code that today exists in France, which is the Middle Next Code. That's a French specificity. Sorry, today the stock exchange and the IMF, the French stock authority, which is the French equivalent to the American SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, actually obliges a listed corporation to make a yearly declaration on its corporate governance practice according to the standards of an official corporate governance code. And the AMF actually accepts two codes as being official. So the one I told about already, I already spoke about, which is the AFEP-MEDEF code, and the Middle Next code, which is an initiative actually which was a co-creation by actually the Middle Next Association And the IFGE and large parts of that code were authored and of the updates here at the French Corporate Governance Institute. So we have very important resources on the specific issue of corporate governance at EMLYON. So people who will follow our executive MBA are actually very fortunate to have access to those resources. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for being here today with us. Thank you, everyone online. The first episode of our webinar series on sustainable futures with Thomas Gauthier is still available online on our YouTube channel. And I invite you to join us on March 16th for the third episode. We will be with Lionel Sitz, a marketing professor in the Executive MBA. And the theme will be, is marketing dead? Value creation in time of crisis. So I hope to see you there. And thank you again for being with us today.